In the modern day, rhetoric is more or less a dirty word. And what I mean by that is that when we say that someone is employing rhetoric, whether it's a politician or a media personality or whoever, we usually mean that they're speaking artificially, that they're speaking with talking points, they're presenting a set of ideas designed to play to certain biases, certain prejudices. Even if it's not outright deception or falsehood, there's the implication that rhetorical speech is in some way misleading, that rhetoric consists of stylistic flourishes designed to obscure the truth, rather than what we might designate as substantive speech, which presumably would attempt to elucidate the truth. And most tellingly, rhetoric is scarcely a word that we apply to ourselves or to our own side in an argument. It's almost always something said about the other side of the argument. Oh, that's just empty rhetoric, right? So too with the word sophistry, which has come to mean an argument that might appear, at least superficially speaking, to be valid, but which serves to hide fallacious reasoning behind it. And if rhetoric has become a dirty word, then sophistry is doubly so. You will find almost no one in the modern discourse, philosophical or otherwise, who will say that they are engaged in sophistry, because to say that is effectively to say that you're being disingenuous. Sophistry for us is the eloquent and convincing speech of a person who is nevertheless trying to deceive you. As those of you who are regular listeners to the program probably already know, the word sophist used to have a very different meaning. The Sophists were originally the teachers of ancient Greece, and the word sophist could be translated as doctor or expert. It's derived from sophos, which means wise, which comes from the same etymological root from which we get the word philosopher or lover of wisdom. In the Hellenic world, the Sophists became an established social institution, teachers who traveled from polis to polis, offering instruction, not only in philosophy as we might understand the term today, but in every useful art or craft. This included poetry, music, gymnastics, but what we mostly know the Sophists for, and the art that was most closely associated with the Sophists, was oratory, and specifically rhetoric. The Sophists were known, in so many words, for teaching people how to speak beautifully. And more than that, how to speak persuasively. And in some sense, those two things are intensely related because the sophistic understanding of the art of speech is that it is an aesthetic art. That a speech, like a sculpture or like a poem, ought to be evaluated based on how it appears. In other words, how it sounds to the ear, how it strikes the ear, what effect it has on the audience, the stylistic aspects of its construction that are apparent in it as one listens to it. So where do we get these negative associations with rhetoric and with the Sophists, who were the teachers of rhetoric? Well, as with everything in philosophy, it all goes back to Socrates and his student Plato. Socrates was a great opponent of the Sophists. He criticized them for taking payment for their teachings. That's the most famous thing that's always said about the Sophists. Whereas Socrates held that wisdom ought to be given freely, because, after all, wisdom leads to virtue, and virtue is good, and not just good for the one who practices virtue, but for all the people around him, and for the polis itself. And furthermore, Socrates conceived of what he was engaged in philosophically as just of a fundamentally different nature from the activity of the Sophists. Whereas they engage in rhetoric, Socrates is engaged in dialectic. Rhetoric may be a technique for making speech appear beautiful, but what matters is the content of speech, the truth of what one is saying. For Socrates, dialectic is a process by which we can acquire episteme, knowledge. And so, while rhetoric may be a useful skill to learn, a techne, an art or craft like the other arts that the Sophists teach, such as gymnastic ability or how to write poems, it is not philosophy. It's not really an attempt to find wisdom. And Plato thus classifies rhetoric as essentially a technique that aims at flattery. It plays to the biases or the prejudices of the audience, as we've said, or to their vanity, perhaps. And this isn't to say that no one should employ rhetoric. One of the great skills of Socrates is his ability in rhetoric, to use a kind of rhetorical irony, often to disarm his opponents. But, as Nietzsche says in his lectures on rhetoric, Plato, quote, holds rhetoric to be legitimate when it rests upon philosophical education, and provided it is used for good aims, i.e. those of philosophy, end quote. In other words, rhetoric is it's like a dressing. It's an aesthetic gloss. It's an externality. It's mere appearance. It's fine when it dresses up real philosophical discussion. The problem is when it dresses up falsehood. And that's when we begin to call it, in the modern sense of the term, pure sophistry. It's because of the fact that we've more or less carried on the Socratic, Platonic interpretation of what the Sophists were doing that it's difficult to get into the headspace in which rhetoric was not regarded in this way. In fact, rhetoric was regarded as perhaps the most important of all skills. And as the Sophists were the teachers of all Greece, and specifically the teachers of rhetoric, accordingly, they were afforded a kind of reverence from the Hellenic world. Even though it aligns with our modern mindset, Socrates' attack on the rhetoricians, on the Sophists, just like his criticisms of art and his suspicions towards the poets, all of this seemed very strange and radical to the ancient Greeks. It was very alien to them. It was as alien to them as it would be to us if somebody were to openly identify as a sophist. This is all to say that the Socratic attack on sophism is part of this entire revaluation of values that Nietzsche identifies. He begins talking about this in his very first book, The Birth of Tragedy, where he begins to outline the war of the theoretic against the tragic, the problem of science, which this problem consists of Socrates taking this abstracted notion of truth, which becomes separated from appearances, which we begin to call mere appearances. This comes with a faith in the intelligible world, as Nietzsche would put it, in the word concept to convey truth, and therefore for words to convey knowledge. And within this Socratic revolution, rhetoric becomes relegated to something less than philosophy. So what we're going to do today is get back into the older Greek headspace and attempt to understand why it was the Greeks placed such a high value on rhetoric. This was a topic of particular importance to Nietzsche, and the main source that we're going to look at today are his lectures in classical rhetoric. These are very helpful not just for understanding the ancient attitude toward rhetoric in general, but also for comprehending how the Sophists profoundly influenced Nietzsche's philosophical thought. And in fact, we can see in some of his writings and notes on rhetoric the basis of ideas that would later make it into one of Nietzsche's philosophical essays. And in particular, we're going to look at one central figure among the Sophists who taught rhetoric, and that is Protagoras. He, in many ways, can be seen as an antecedent to Nietzsche, or rather Nietzsche could be seen as a modern-day Protagoras. Now, the first complication in making this claim is that we don't actually know that much about Protagoras, relatively speaking. What does come to us about Protagoras is almost entirely from later sources, and there are competing interpretations about the real significance of Protagoras as a thinker. What we know for certain is that Protagoras is the one who establishes this relationship between the Sophists and the art of oratory. Perhaps the best source for introducing us to Protagoras is found in the work of Diogenes Laertius, whose work, The Lives of Eminent Philosophers, was one of Nietzsche's favorite ancient sources. Diogenes Laertius says in his chapter on Protagoras, quote, Protagoras was the first to maintain that there are two sides to every question, opposed to each other, and he even argued in this fashion, being the first to do so. Furthermore, he began a work thus, quote, Man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not, end quote. He used to say that soul was nothing apart from the senses, as we learn from Plato in the Theaetetus, and that everything is true. In another work he began thus, quote, As to the gods, I have no means of knowing either that they exist or that they do not exist. For many are the obstacles that impede knowledge, both the obscurity of the question and the shortness of human life, End quote. For this introduction to his book, the Athenians expelled him, and they burnt his works in the marketplace, after sending round a herald to collect them from all who had copies in their possession. End quote. So we can see immediately the similarities between Nietzsche's positions and those of Protagoras, at least in the broadest possible strokes. Man is the measure of all things. This is Protagoras' most famous quote. It's really his only famous quote. It is human beings who determine what is and what is not. Now, you could interpret that many ways, but the parallel to Nietzsche that jumps out immediately to me is the passage in Human All Too Human, quote, "We see by means of our human head and cannot cut it off, though one wonders what would remain over of the world if it had been cut off," end quote. So in other words, we know the world only through sensation and representations of those sensations. We do not know the thing in itself. We experience the world entirely within our own nervous system, and we represent the world. We present it again in the form of concepts and images in order to understand it. Accordingly, the soul is not separate from the senses. That is another proposition of Protagoras that would seem to be right in line with Nietzsche's conception of the soul. For Nietzsche, the true self is the body. The soul is not a separable consciousness that can be conceptualized as detached from sensation and detached from physiological impulse. The soul is embodied. Furthermore, there are two sides to every question. Everything is true. Those types of statements would call to mind Nietzsche's coinage that there are, quote, "no moral facts, only moral interpretations of the facts," end quote. In a word, this is Nietzsche's perspectivism, or what could only be called a kind of moral relativism. So, rather than a common or a universal moral truth, there is only what is right according to the measurement, or we might say the evaluation, the judgment, of particular embodied parties acting in the world. And Protagoras would seem to go farther, not merely applying this to morality, but to our entire perspective of reality itself, as Nietzsche arguably does in his unpublished notes. Finally, Protagoras is known for his agnosticism. He says he doesn't know whether gods exist or not, because human knowledge is fallible. It's too limited to actually attain knowledge in this regard. So we have no transcendent or metaphysical certainties by which to ground or anchor our perspective, or to anchor our moral understanding. There is no immaculate perception, as I like to put it, no perception from a God's eye view that at the very least, there's nothing of that sort that's available to human beings. And we should be honest about our situation. Life is short. Our knowledge of the world is limited. We know the world only through our senses, and therefore we are left with a host of differing perspectives, bounded to one's time and place, and bounded to who and what one is. So we can see why Protagoras can be meaningfully compared to Nietzsche, even with only this rather paltry collection of quotations sourced to him and facts about his life. And further, far from being a cynical manipulator of others, who disregarded the real truth in favor of mere appearance, Protagoras holds to the position that there is no real truth apart from that outward appearance, at least none that's available to us. Or, to say the same thing in the opposite way, as Protagoras does in the Theaetetus, everything is true. The truth as we know it is inseparable from the senses. It's inseparable from who and what we are, and so we can't get away from our role as human beings, which is to say our role as the measurers of things. We have to make judgments and evaluations. And because we have these different vantage points and different experiences, different skills, different knowledge, different desires, our truths also differ. But this is not the same as saying that we should ignore substance in favor of style or something like that when it comes to advancing our arguments. Instead, what Protagoras offers is a diametrically opposed worldview to that of the Socratics, who are the very people who make that division between style and substance, between truth and mere appearance. No, every perspective is true to that perspective, according to the measure that the person with that perspective has taken of things. It's true precisely because it appears true, because we're not in the position to make a judgment about the distinction between them, because all we have is appearance. Nietzsche gives a description of Protagoras and of the significance of Protagoras in an essay entitled The History of Greek Eloquence. This is an obscure essay, and you can see from both his notebooks and his lecture notes that this essay was a polished version of the ideas and interpretations that Nietzsche developed while teaching as a philologist. Nietzsche writes, quote, "The actual sophists, the higher teachers from Greece proper and from the eastern colonies, presented a much more comprehensive theory. Instruction in oratory is just a part of their activity. Sophism originated with Protagoras' journey through the Hellenistic cities, which he began circa 455 BC. He influenced Attic eloquence much earlier than did the Sicilians. He promises to teach ton heto logon kroito poiein, how one can, by means of dialectics, help the weaker case win out. This dialectics was made to make all other arts and sciences superfluous. How, without being a geometrician, one can outrage the geometrician. And likewise on natural philosophy, wrestling, the practical life of the state. The pupils had to learn model speeches by heart. Despite posing the tasks of dialectics in this manner, the great sophists were concentrating powers of the highest rank, combining various kinds of knowledge, and achieving a higher level of education. A practical result of their new education, after the middle of the 5th century, was the great Pericles. He engaged in many debates with Protagoras." End quote. Now, just a quick clarification. It should be clear from context, but Nietzsche's not using dialectic in the Socratic sense here. He simply means dialogue. Because, after all, rather than a process that unveils the truth, the dialectical technique of the sophists that originates with Protagoras, as Nietzsche describes it, is a means of making the weaker case defeat the stronger case. And that is perhaps the most succinct summation of the Socratic problem with sophism, because if you hold to the idea that there's a form of the true, a universal truth that dialogue is supposed to uncover, then making the weaker defeat the stronger might seem to be making the false position triumph over the true position. But again, that's not how the sophists would have conceived of their art. The sophistic instruction in the art of persuasion doesn't have that aim of making the false appear true. That's a sort of slander against it. It's of strengthening the case to be made for one of these many differing perspectives. The fact that some cases are stronger, just outright, and some are weaker outright, doesn't speak to some of those perspectives being truer than others. It's rather how the case shall appear in the eyes of others, how it shall be received by others. Another important thing that Nietzsche points out is that oratory is only a part of a much more comprehensive education, because if you're to argue about geometry, for example, it helps to know about geometry. Again, this may seem to us as if the sophists are willing to learn the real truth, the objective truth, if only to manipulate people, but we have to remember what the art of rhetoric is meant to empower. It's a case, a position. In other words, not knowledge proper, but an opinion about knowledge, a viewpoint, an interpretation. And while Socrates would have held that opinion is inherently less valuable than knowledge, the sophists would have held that speech doesn't convey knowledge at all, at least not in the way that Socrates might think that it does. In one of the sections of Nietzsche's lectures on rhetoric, which is called The Relation of Rhetoric to Language, Nietzsche puts forward this view of the sophists on language and the function of speech as they saw it. And what is fascinating about this passage, aside from our exploration of the sophists more broadly and rhetoric more broadly, is that we can see the ways in which Nietzsche's interpretation of ancient rhetoric anticipates the arguments that Nietzsche would later make in the essay on truth and lies in the non-moral sense. In fact, he even uses some of the same phrases and arguments that he makes in that essay, word for word. But the explanation he gives here of the relation between rhetoric and language is fascinating because he begins with similar observations to those that I made at the beginning of this episode, that we think of rhetorical speech as artificial. We think of it as unnatural. We think of it as something added on to the content, to the substance of our words. But Nietzsche argues that this is not the case. Quote, "There is obviously no unrhetorical naturalness of language to which one could appeal. Language itself is the result of purely rhetorical arts. the power to discover and to make operative that which works and impresses with respect to each thing, a power which Aristotle calls rhetoric, is at the same time the essence of language. The latter is based just as little as rhetoric is upon that which is true, upon the essence of things. Language does not desire to instruct, but to convey to others a subjective impulse and its acceptance. Man, who forms language, does not perceive things or events, but impulses. He does not communicate sensations, but merely copies of sensations. The sensation, evoked through a nerve impulse, does not take in the thing itself. This sensation is presented externally through an image." End quote. So Nietzsche echoes the sentiments of Protagoras here, that we do not know the world directly, we know sensation, we know impulses, and that by a further degree of removal, language does not directly communicate even these sensations. That would be like if human beings were empaths that could, in the manner of, aliens in a sci-fi novel, for example, maybe touch one another and directly transmit physiological sense data or something of the sort. But no, our nervous system represents the world to us, and that comes in the form of a sign. And rather than directly communicating the representations, then by an even further degree of removal, we create a sign of the sign. We represent the sensation by making a sound, a word. And so Nietzsche goes on to argue, also very much in the spirit of Protagoras, quote, "It is not the things that pass over into consciousness, but the manner in which we stand toward them. The pythanon," which means power of persuasion, plausibility, also a thing producing illusion. "The full essence of things will never be grasped. Our utterances by no means wait until our perception and experience have provided us with a many-sided, somehow respectable knowledge of things. They result immediately when the impulse is perceived. Instead of the thing, the sensation takes in only a sign. That is the first aspect. Language is rhetoric, because it desires to convey only a doxa, opinion, not an episteme, knowledge." End quote. And so, I think it's a shame that this material from Nietzsche's lectures remains so obscure, because this is it's a bombshell of a passage. It's a dynamite passage. Particularly that last sentence, language is rhetoric. The entire basis of language is rhetorical, insofar as the basis of language is metaphor, which is to say that we analogize from a sensation to an image, and from the image that we wish to convey to a sound that signifies that image, and so on and so forth. So there's always an artfulness in language, a relativity to language from the very beginning, and a sense of creativity to it. And what Nietzsche says that rhetoric really is then is simply the development of that artistic aspect of language that is always there, that is inherent to it, but the development of it under the light of conscious reflection. Perhaps most importantly, this means that language only conveys doxai, competing opinions, beliefs, or perspectives. And so this would be the counter to the Socratic allegation that the Sophists deceive through rhetoric by ignoring the ability of speech to instruct, to construct an episteme, right? The Sophists would say, that is your own misapprehension about what language does. Language does not convey truth, at least not in the objective sense, in the sense of the form of the true, or whatever we might call it. If it conveys truth, it conveys a perspectival truth. And so the Sophists endeavored to teach men not to speak truly, but to speak persuasively. And Nietzsche says that this ability, he says that it is not, quote, knowledge in the scientific sense, end quote. It is instead a dynamis, which means power or ability, quote, which could, however, be elevated to a techne, an art or craft, end quote. Perhaps Aristotle's definition of rhetoric is the best one in light of this. It's one that Nietzsche also seems to favor, quote, the power, faculty, or ability to observe all possible means of persuasion about each thing, end quote. Does this mean that the rhetorician is always successful in persuading? No, and this did trouble the Sophists in coming to define their art, because sometimes the most skillful speech still fails to persuade. Nietzsche relates at one point in this essay the story of Antiphon, who defended himself against the charge of treason. Thucydides says that Antiphon gave the best defense speech of his age. But Antiphon still lost his trial, in spite of this incredible speech. So as Nietzsche puts it, quote, "The rhetor can defend a difficult cause just as a physician who cares for an incurable patient," end quote. So in other words, if the power to persuade, what it does is grants you the ability to make the weaker argument become stronger, one may accomplish this and still find that their argument is too weak to overcome the opposing perspective. In the same way that a doctor might manage to strengthen a terminal patient, but not enough for the patient to overcome the disease. And this wouldn't mean that medicine is not a real or coherent art if the patient still dies. So this is the education that the Sophists provided, following the model of Protagoras: to speak well, to speak beautifully, to be eloquent, persuasive, and commanding with the art of oratory. And owing to the structure of democratic political life, which is very different from our own in several important respects, that skill is indispensable to the Greeks. Because unlike us, the Athenians practiced direct democracy rather than electing representatives, and unlike us, the Athenians did not have any equivalent of the legal occupation. To be a citizen of Athens meant that you were freer, in a sense, than people living in almost any of the other civilizations on Earth during this time, insofar as you possess a measure of political power over your destiny in the form of your vote and the ability to debate issues openly and so on. But this position as a citizen also came with an immense responsibility, insofar as every man was his own democratic representative and every man was his own lawyer. Nietzsche writes about the significance of this, quote, "Now there was in Athens the custom of advocates in the form of logographoi, for lawyers in our sense of the word were forbidden. Each person was allowed to file a lawsuit, but everyone had to defend himself. Only legal assistants were allowed. They could not accept money. Specific grounds had to be given for their appearance in court. And so the defense was often written up by trained and experienced orators and then read by the defendant." End quote. So oratory to the Greeks is the essentially political art, especially in Athens, because it is how men contest the laws in the polity, and it's how they defend themselves or advocate a case against someone else. You could hire an orator to write your speech, as Nietzsche says, but you had to deliver it. And this meant you had to learn how to speak confidently. We might say you had to learn how to speak dramatically. And all of us ought to know, two people could read the same words in very different ways. You know, a person can go up and read a speech with dramatic flourishes and with passion in their voice, with all the gestures and inflections and techniques of speaking. And another person can read the exact same speech in a monotone voice in the most boring way possible. And the audience will experience these two speeches, even though it's the same speech in terms of content, they'll experience them in completely different ways, regardless of the substance being the same. So the orator writing your speech can only go so far in helping you defend yourself. And there did eventually arise a whole industry of speechwriters for this very purpose. But the free citizen of Athens who neglected his study of oratory, who neglected his study of rhetorical persuasion, would be setting himself up for catastrophe if he were ever to find himself facing criminal charges that you're called upon to refute, and you must do so yourself. And further, without oratorical and rhetorical skill, he would be unable to properly exercise his political power to the extent that he has it. He'd be unable to effectively argue for a given course of action when the time came for the polis to deliberate on some important issue, such as, do we go to war or not? You know, you might feel strongly one way or the other, but it's the powerful speaker who will end up determining what the polis does, not necessarily the speakers who have all of the facts at hand or have the better substantive argument. And so there is a logic, owing to the legal and political structures, especially of the Greek democracies, that centers rhetoric and eloquence as the most important skill of political life, as the political skill par excellence. And because oratory has this central position as the greatest of the technique, Nietzsche argues that it begins to amount to an obsession among the Greeks. In one of Nietzsche's passages in The Gay Science, this is section 80, he discusses this fixation with oratory and how it seeps into every aspect of Greek life, and not only their civic life, their political life, but also their love of poetry, their dramas. The social institution of the symposium can be seen as part of this as well. Nietzsche writes, quote, "The Greeks, or at least the Athenians, liked to hear people speak well. Nothing distinguishes them so thoroughly from the non-Greeks as does this truly greedy craving. Even of passion on the stage, they demanded that it should speak well." End quote. So this is part of what defines what it means to be Greek. It's a cultural trait, being a good speaker. This is not something that the Greeks just happen to be good at. This is something that is central to their life, that they worked at, that they developed over centuries of instruction. And again, the people who instructed them were the Sophists. Returning to the essay, The History of Greek Eloquence, Nietzsche writes, quote, "To no task did the Greeks devote such incessant labor as to eloquence. The amount of energy they expended on oratory can perhaps be symbolized by Demosthenes' autodidactism. Devotion to oratory is the most tenacious element of Greek culture and survives through all the curtailments of their condition. It is communicable, contagious, as can be seen from the Romans and the whole Hellenistic world. Again and again, in a new age, rhetoric blossoms forth. Hellenic culture and power gradually concentrate on oratorical skill. It probably also spells their doom." End quote. And we might ask, why does the obsession with oratory perhaps spell the doom of the Greeks? Well, that might take us a bit away from the main topic, but this ties in with Nietzsche's criticism of the Greeks that they became a nation of actors. And perhaps the simplest way to get this across is that the kind of oratory that was practiced in political life was, in straightforward terms, a way of exercising force. When Pericles gives his famous funeral oration, and remember, Nietzsche mentioned earlier, he was instructed by Protagoras, and debated and sharpened his oratorical skill with Protagoras. What Pericles is attempting to do is to shape the public opinion of the Athenians, to raise their morale, to stir their patriotism. And in the arena of political debates and public speeches in these early democratic societies, war is waged with the tongue. And this is why the teaching of rhetoric is so essential. But as this blossoms into a full-fledged obsession, it becomes simply another means of pleasure or entertainment. It's simply enjoying beautiful speech for the sake of hearing beautiful speech. There is something, Nietzsche would have said, decadent about that. It becomes a form of hedonic pleasure, an end unto itself, rather than the way of shaping opinion in order to attain one's ends, rather than being a means of force. Now, famously, Nietzsche called the ancient Greek culture the culture of the Sophists. And in that same passage where he says this, he argues that the Sophists must have been rather immoral according to our modern standards. And this is because of the very fact of how they see speech and how they use speech. Speech is essentially artistic, as we've gone over. It's essentially perspectival. And so Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, this is volume 2, aphorism 221, that the Sophists use what he calls artistic illusion in order to, quote, "ever and anon to gain the mastery over forced seriousness, to arrange, beautify, simplify. That is the continual task from Homer to the Sophists of the 3rd and 4th centuries of our era, who are all outward show, pompous speech, declamatory gestures, and address themselves to shallow souls that care only for appearance, sound, and effect." End quote. And that's the real function of speech from the sophistic perspective, to create an appearance, to create an effect, and thus to exercise an influence. Again, speech is the use of force from this perspective. And when Nietzsche says that this influence is addressed to shallow souls, we have to remember that he calls the Greeks shallow but out of profundity, that the Greeks live in a world of pure appearance. This is something that Nietzsche actually admires about the Greeks. There's something naive and obviously unphilosophical about this way of living, as Nietzsche says, stopping heroically at the surface of existence and dwelling there, living there. But regardless of how we think about it, this is the older Greek mindset, insofar as they did not possess that concept of objectivity, at least not in the same sense that we have it. Nietzsche says in his lecture on rhetoric, quote, "Rhetoric arises among a people who still live in mythic images and who have not yet experienced the unqualified need of historical accuracy. They would rather be persuaded than instructed," end quote. That's another reason why it's very difficult for us to get into the mindset of the sophist culture, because after we have developed this notion of objectivity in the modern sense, it's basically impossible to go back to such a naive state of mind. And we tend to be on guard against being persuaded, especially if we feel the persuasion's untethered to the objective facts as we might see them. Unlike the Greeks, we don't want to be affected by someone else's speech, to be at the mercy of someone else's speech. Nobody wants to believe that they're susceptible to propaganda, for example. At least when it comes to civic or political life, we just don't want to be influenced in that way. We like to think that we're above that kind of influence. But we still have that same craving that the Greeks did when it comes to the arts. When we see a film, we do want to be moved, right? We'll allow ourselves to be carried away by the emotional impact of a speech or a dialogue in that context. But in the political life, what we really want to believe is that we're educated, we're informed, and that our political activity springs from the knowledge we hold. The Greeks, as Nietzsche said, would rather be persuaded. They would say, "Go on, give your speech, move me, make me feel the way you do, if you can." And I would argue, as an aside, that the sophistic conception is more honest than our own. That most people who think of themselves as informed are not informed, at least not nearly to the level that they think they are. Most people do make their political decisions based on emotions, based on the ability of speakers to impress or move them to actions, based on pretty words. And this, for me at least, is the appeal of the sophist position. It reflects the world that we actually live in, governed by passion, governed by what sounds good and what makes us feel a certain way, rather than that Socratic view of how speech and dialogue works, which reflects this ideal world that doesn't really exist, but that we might like to live in, like Plato's Republic, a republic governed by reason, where the people who make the decisions make those decisions according to a sovereign governing reason. And one could argue that it's therefore the sophistic vision is actually more empowering, even though we might like to denigrate it in the modern day, because it tells us how things really are, tells us the truth about the political life. Now, to return to Protagoras, our central figure, he actually has a rather interesting relationship to Socrates and Plato. He appears in two Platonic dialogues, in the Theaetetus and in one in which is named for him, the Protagoras. And while Socrates argues with Protagoras and he subjects him to the usual Socratic cross-examination that we've all come to know and love, Protagoras is also given a very long passage in the dialogue named for him, which is known now as the Great Speech, in which Protagoras is allowed by Plato to expound his viewpoints. Plato affords Protagoras that dignity, that opportunity, even within his version of the interaction. And as we all know, Plato's versions of the Socratic dialogues always make Socrates come out looking better, but Plato even gives Protagoras the last word in the dialogue. So, point being, unlike some sophistic figures, which are presented wholly negatively, like Thrasymachus, for example, Protagoras seems to be a figure deserving at least some respect in the eyes of the anti-sophists, Socrates and Plato. Furthermore, in the Protagoras, when Socrates asks Protagoras what it is that he teaches, Protagoras tells us something that may be surprising if we approach this dialogue assuming that all Protagoras stands for is empty rhetoric. Socrates says, if you go and receive an instruction under the master flute player, you'll presumably acquire knowledge of how to play the flute. If you study under a master sculptor, you will acquire knowledge of how to sculpt. What knowledge do the sophists teach? What will they learn from you, Protagoras? Protagoras defines the skill that he teaches as, quote, prudence in affairs private as well as public, end quote. Protagoras says that the student who learns from him, quote, will learn to order his own house in the best manner, and he will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state, end quote. And Socrates then asks a clarifying question, quote, do I understand you? Is your meaning that you teach the art of politics, and that you promise to make men good citizens, end quote. And Protagoras' answer is, quote, that, Socrates, is exactly the profession which I make, end quote. Now, what are we to make of this? Because as far as we're concerned in the modern age, there's very little connection between rhetorical skill and becoming a good citizen. And when Protagoras says he teaches prudence, the ability to order one's house, the ability to speak and act well, that sounds almost like a course of ethical instruction. But this is precisely how Socrates would have conceived of his own teaching, isn't it, as ethical instruction? Furthermore, to make things even stranger, in the long speech that follows, Protagoras makes the argument that virtue can be taught, whereas Socrates, of all people, suggests that Protagoras is wrong about this, and that virtue can't be taught. So, if you attempt to learn about Protagoras and the Sophists from this Platonic dialogue, you're immediately thrown for a loop, because at first glance it seems that Protagoras is cast as the moralist, and Socrates' criticism of him seems to fly in the face of what Socrates himself teaches. And so, how are we to make sense of this? Protagoras' great speech, as it is called, invokes the story of Prometheus, with which I'm sure we're mostly familiar. Epimetheus and Prometheus are tasked with giving all the animals, all the living beings that the gods had created, some quality or power that would allow them to survive and flourish. Epimetheus waits to distribute his gift to mankind until the very end, but he finds that when it's time for man to receive their own special ability, Epimetheus has run out of powers to grant. And this makes mankind vulnerable to all the other animals who have fangs and claws and poison and wings and all sorts of traits against which mankind is helpless. So Prometheus, who pities man, steals from the gods so that mankind will be protected. He steals the fire from Hephaestus and the art of crafting, of making things, from Athena. The power of fire, of the forge, and the wisdom of creation. And perhaps most infamously, the story ends with Prometheus condemned to torment, eternal torment, chained to a rock while vultures eat his liver for all eternity. But the story does not end there. What happens next is that with this knowledge, mankind forms cities and they begin to live together. But upon establishing their cities, people continue to act and behave as they did in the state of nature. In other words, the way that Thomas Hobbes would later describe things, right? In the state of nature, no one can trust another man because there's no common bond between them. Everyone's out for himself, which means I might betray you at any time for my own advantage, which means there's no possibility of cooperation, which means nothing gets built, nothing gets done. And this is the condition of these earliest cities of mankind in this myth. And the god who intercedes to rectify the situation is not Prometheus, whom Zeus has now imprisoned and punished, but rather Zeus himself. Protagoras says, quote, "After a while, the desire of self-preservation gathered them into cities, but when they were gathered together, having no art of government, they treated one another maliciously, and were again in process of dispersion and destruction. Zeus feared that humanity would be exterminated, and so he sent Hermes to them, bearing reverence and justice to be the ordering principles of cities and the bonds of friendship and conciliation. Hermes asked Zeus how he should impart justice and reverence among men. Should he distribute them as the arts are distributed, that is to say, to a favored few only, with one skilled individual having enough of medicine or of any other art for many unskilled ones? Shall this be the manner in which I am to distribute justice and reverence among men, or shall I give them to all? To all, said Zeus. I should like them all to have a share, for cities cannot exist if a few only share in the virtues, as in the arts, and further make a law by my order that he who has no part in reverence and justice shall be put to death, for he is a plague on the state. And this is the reason, Socrates, why the Athenians, and mankind in general, when the question relates to carpentering or any other mechanical art, allow but a few to share in their deliberations, but when they meet to deliberate about political virtue, which proceeds only by way of justice and wisdom, they are patient enough of any man who speaks of them, because they think that every man ought to share in this sort of virtue, and that states could not exist if this were otherwise." End quote. So, again, this position of Protagoras may seem odd, given everything that we've seen about the Sophists, because the argument that all men have the capacity to act virtuously may strike our ear as a Socratic teaching and not a Sophist one. And so to begin to untangle this, the first thing we really have to understand is how the Greeks understood concepts such as wisdom and justice. And we discussed this when we went over the Oresteia by Aeschylus, the trilogy in which the word justice, dike, is used more often than in any other Greek drama. Justice in the Greek sense is, as it is presented in this myth, a trait or quality that someone possesses. In modern terms, we tend to think of justice in the abstract, as like a noun. When we speak of justice, we think of achieving it as a kind of idealized state of affairs. Perhaps we might think of attaining equality of rights, or establishing laws that are applied fairly and with due process, or whatever the case may be. Justice is the kind of thing that occurs in the form of a system, right? But justice for the Greeks is something an individual possesses, the way we would describe someone acting justly. And perhaps a better translation of the term justice is the word right. The just man is the one who acts rightly, which is to say, acts within his right. To be just is to take part in civic life, to act in accord with what your rights are, and with respect to the rights of others. In so many words, to yield to the common law, which exists above all who live in the polity, in terms of one's actions and duties. And so the just man is the political man, in so many words. Again, not so different from the Socratic conception, as Aristotle's conception runs in his Politics. Man is the political animal. And unlike these other aptitudes, which are unevenly distributed, such that not everyone is skilled in medical arts or flute playing, all men who live in the polity have to be just, to the extent that they have to act in accord with their right. Or else Zeus decrees they become a plague on the state and they have to be executed. And this is the part of Protagoras' conception of how virtue is taught, which sounds very unsocratic or anti-Socratic even, and again may conjure Thomas Hobbes, because Protagoras argues that it is by force, by power, that men are made to act virtuously. It is by punishment, it's by social shaming, that men's unjust behavior is corrected. Protagoras says it would be foolish to reproach someone for, say, being ugly or short or sickly, as if by chastising them you could make them decide to become beautiful or tall or healthy. But as we can see, men do regularly reproach one another for acting unjustly. And by the law enforcing punishment on those who do act unjustly, and by these reproachments, the law forces people to correct their behavior. Protagoras says, quote, "He who desires to inflict rational punishment does not retaliate for a past wrong which cannot be undone. He has regard to the future, and is desirous that the man who is punished and he who sees him punished may be deterred from doing wrong again. He punishes for the sake of prevention, thereby clearly implying that virtue is capable of being taught. This is the notion of all who retaliate upon others, either privately or publicly. And the Athenians too, your own citizens, like other men, punish and take vengeance on all whom they regard as evildoers. And hence we may infer them to be of the number of those who think that virtue may be acquired and taught." End quote. And it's worth noting, this is how Nietzsche says that we developed a memory and genealogy of morality, not just a sense of justice, as Protagoras describes it here. That's certainly related. It's like a prerequisite to having a sense of justice. But the ability to make promises at all, which means the ability to agree to follow the law, or to repay a debt, or to swear an oath, that all requires a memory. All of these things that are essential for civic life. So Nietzsche asks, how did we acquire the memory to be able to do this, to remember the promises that we've made? Well, Nietzsche attributes this to punishment, and to the public witness of punishment as well, as Protagoras mentions here, the one who is punished, and, perhaps even more importantly, the ones who see him being punished. They are all deterred from doing wrong again in the future. You can't really take revenge for what happened in the past, or you can't get justice for what's already happened in the past, but you can have your eye to the future, as Protagoras says. What does it require in order for that deterrence to last into the future? Well, it's a good memory, and so that's just a brief aside, but perhaps there is some inspiration there from Protagoras on Nietzsche's thought of the creative power of punishment to force men to remember. This is what will happen to me if I break this law. And in any case, it would seem to be hard to refute Protagoras, at least insofar as if virtue were enough, we wouldn't need the law. Everyone knows how far virtue really goes when the law is no longer enforced, which is not very far. And on the other hand, when the law is in place, people do tend to act quote unquote virtuously. But does that have to do with some sort of inner discipline or power, or is it having to do with the fact that they know that punishment will ensue if they don't act that way? The evidence for this is what we see with our own eyes, that we live in cities that are able to cooperate and function. Everyone is able to subordinate their actions beneath a common law, but take away the enforcement arm of that law and see how far virtue really gets you, right? And this is why, even though some men are more just than others, justice is manifestly teachable to all. Teachable by means of force, right? Because unlike, say, someone's physical attributes, people can learn to act rightly, or at least be forced to act rightly. Now, if we contrast this with the Socratic conception of justice in the Republic, the difference in how these two men think about political life, I think, shall become more clear. It also becomes clear why Socrates advances this perhaps strange argument that virtue can't be taught, which seems to fly in the face of the Socratic project. In the ideal republic, what happens is a sort of selection mechanism in Socrates' vision for determining whom among the populace is right for rulership, who is right to become one of the soldiers to defend the republic, or who is right to become simply one of the ordinary citizens in a productive trade or craft. And Socrates does advocate for a course of education, but his republic is not actually premised on the idea that virtue is found equally in all men, nor is wisdom found equally in all. In fact, the magnificent myth, that story that's so often referenced in the Republic and so often translated as noble lie, it concerns itself with precisely this issue, that we'll have to come up with a story to tell everyone for why some are suited in their very essence to become rulers, and others suited for a lesser station in life. That all the citizens are born from the earth, and the philosopher ruler is comprised of gold. That's what he has in his soul. It's the most precious metal. The auxiliaries are comprised of silver. The tradesmen are made of baser metals. So Socrates does wish to institute the reign of justice governed by the wise. But his vision is not that all have a share in justice or wisdom, but that some have a greater share than others. And so justice in its totality will only be achieved when those with the greatest share stand in the proper relation of rulership toward those with a lesser share. And of course, for Socrates, the form that the ruler's wisdom takes is none other than philosophy, understood as that dialectical revelation of the truth. The philosopher is the rightful ruler because it is he who can employ reason, and therefore he who knows the truth. And so, while it may seem like the Socratic project is all about teaching virtue, in many ways, Socrates' form of education it's more like a selection mechanism than it is based on the faith that all men were given the capacity for wisdom and justice by the god Zeus, which is what Protagoras invokes. Now, what follows the great speech of Protagoras is Socrates' cross-examination of him and his attempt to deconstruct the things that Protagoras has said about virtue. We're going to leave that aside for our purposes. It's certainly very interesting for understanding Socratic philosophy, but what is of interest to us here, returning again to our attempt to understand that ancient conception of rhetoric from the perspective of the Sophists, is the conception of wisdom that Protagoras provides to us, that differing conception of wisdom from the one that Socrates would hold. As Nietzsche would later argue in Twilight of Idols, the Sophists concern themselves with what is, rather than what could be or what ought to be if there were an ideal world, as the Platonists do. Nietzsche contrasts Thucydides with Plato in that particular aphorism. Protagoras portrays that world in which punishment and force are effective in making men act rightly, and so that is his conception of justice. And in that world, as Protagoras conceives of it, justice would not be reached by sitting around and contemplating it philosophically or debating it philosophically. Again, to make the analogy to Hobbes, it's a product of the Hobbesian Leviathan. Remember what Protagoras said at the beginning. He teaches prudence, the ability to order your house, to speak and act for the best in the context of political life. So, what would wisdom be? What would it mean to speak and act prudently in a political life which is all-encompassing? As Nietzsche says, the Greeks are the political men par excellence, and a political life which is ruled by force. If the polity is not ruled by the one who is the most reasonable, or the most philosophical, or the one who has the greatest possession of the truth, then what does determine who rules? And here the argument comes full circle. It is the pythanon, the power of persuasion. Again, a term that also has the connotation of weaving illusions. That's what grants the ability to rule. That's what grants the ability to impress, as if by an act of force, to impress one's perspective, one's own feeling, onto the souls of other men. Nietzsche quotes Diodorus on this topic in his essay on the history of Greek eloquence. Quote, "No one will be able easily to name a higher prerogative than oratory, for it is by virtue of oratory that the Greeks excel the other nations, and the educated person the uneducated. Moreover, it is by oratory alone that one individual acquires authority over many, but in general everything appears only as the speaker's power represents it." End quote. So in the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, Nietzsche makes the point that in modern terms, or at least in his day, in contemporary Germany, contemporary to Nietzsche, to be educated and to be historically educated might as well be synonyms, right? Or we might say that education in the U.S. education system in modern day, at least when I was going through the education system, they would have said it was like synonymous with like critical thinking or something like that. But to the Greeks, the difference between the educated and the uneducated is whether you have the power to speak. What it is that gives you authority over many is not the possession of truth, objective truth, right? As the situation is conceived of, at least in the ideal world in Plato's Republic. What gives you authority is the power to make everything appear only as your power represents it. And the example that Nietzsche uses is Callisthenes, who felt that he held in his own hands the fate of Alexander. How could that be the case? I mean, how could it be the case that a great king should find his legacy in the power of the one who memorializes the deeds of the great king? Well, I mean, quite simply, Alexander's divinity is determined by the orators, what they say about Alexander's deeds. It doesn't matter what the so-called objective facts or the historical truth of Alexander was, because once Alexander is dead, none of that exists anymore, not in present reality. It only exists in memory. And because memory is malleable, according to the opinions that people possess, in a way that makes the one who shapes the nature of those memories, who presents or represents the memories in a certain way, that is who really has the power. And so the Socratics, again, they place this lesser value on opinion. That's one of the most famous things that Socrates says. Opinion is beneath the value of truth. But in a way, it is actually opinion that determines truth, quote unquote. Because if all of those who are tasked with memorializing Alexander, the poets and the playwrights and the orators, portray him as a demigod and a great leader and a military genius worthy of praise, then that becomes the truth of Alexander. But suppose instead that they portrayed him as a tyrant and a fool and an Icarus-like figure who perhaps maybe he had some talent, but he flew too close to the sun. He brought about his own downfall. I mean, how stupid can you be marching your troops through the desert without a water source? Well, if that's how you remember Alexander, then that determines the truth of Alexander. And this happens all the time with historical figures, where the public opinion or the mass opinion shapes the quote-unquote truth about that figure. At least insofar as the only place where Alexander lives on today is in people's heads. So the opinions they possess and the way they think about him, the way they remember him, is the reality. And I think a particularly strong example of this would be Caesar, similar to a kind of Alexandrian figure as well. But, it was very normal for Caesar to be seen as a tyrant, especially by the English gentleman historian types, people like Edward Gibbon, who would portray Caesar as the man who attacked the Roman republican form of government, who was an enemy of freedom, an enemy of liberty. Whereas in modern times, we might have more nuanced opinions of Caesar, that really what he was attacking was not so much a republic as an oligarchy, that he wasn't so much an enemy of freedom and liberty as he was an enemy of the freedom of an aristocratic class to continue living the way of life, the parasitical lifestyle that they had enjoyed for several centuries. Now, which one of those two viewpoints is the correct quote-unquote view of Caesar? Well, no matter what, you're going to have to involve evaluation, judgment, and therefore interpretation of the facts in assessing what kind of man Caesar was, whether he was indeed a tyrant or maybe he was perhaps a liberator in some form, or a reformer, an attempted reformer who was killed for his efforts, as some people have seen him. No matter what, there's an element of interpretation there. There's an element of opinion there. And because Caesar is not actually around, it's only the memory of Caesar, it's only the interpretation of memories and records that we really have, you can make the argument that opinion is really the thing that shapes the destiny, the legacy of who Caesar is. And Nietzsche says that the Sophists were aware of this. They were aware of this power of opinion. We have an indication, for example, in another Platonic dialogue when Socrates is speaking to Gorgias, who says quite straightforwardly, quote, "Socrates, if only you knew how rhetoric comprehends and holds under her sway all the inferior arts," end quote. And what is meant by this is that, you can claim that philosophy and your search for the truth is the superior art, but I say it's inferior, because I have the power to shape how everyone else feels about philosophy, how they think about philosophy, how they interpret your philosophical truths. And if I have that power, then it doesn't matter what your philosophy tells you the truth is. Again, the rhetorician can outwit the geometrician in an argument about geometry. He can beat the musician in an argument about music. He can outshine the poet in a dispute over the art of writing verse. And these beliefs about the power of persuasive speech, they really do go to great lengths, insofar as it almost verges as on a kind of magical power in the Greek conception. Now, the Greeks had pre-established cultural beliefs about this, surrounding what we might call word magic, the ability of words to literally reshape reality. So Nietzsche, in one of the passages of The Gay Science, suggests that the origins of poetry are found in this idea, that the Greeks believed that by binding one's words into a rhythm, one could give their words a kind of hypnotic quality. And so the prayers to the gods that were arranged into a poetic, metrical rhythm are meant not to, entreat the gods in all humility, as we might pray to the Christian God today, but to enchant and enrapture the gods, to compel the gods, to force them as if by a spell to come to your aid or to listen to your grievances and find some way to help you in some way, to remediate them. And this then leads to a belief in the use of music and rhythm as a way to cure ailments. Music becomes part of the medical arts, that it can even sort of hold sway over the body. Nietzsche mentions a number of stories from ancient Greece wherein this was said to have occurred. He says that by using poetry and music in this way, quote, "Terpander quieted a tumult, Empedocles calmed a maniac, Damon purged a lovesick youth. By means of it, even the maddened, revengeful gods were treated for the purpose of a cure," end quote. Now, the reason why I bring this up, even though this episode isn't really about poetry, is that it points to something in the Greek mind about the power of the word, and not in the sense of the Christian understanding, of the logos, or in the sense of the Socratic understanding of the dialectic. It's more akin to the way that Socrates talks about the power of poetry. Socrates talks about this in a very negative light because, Socrates thinks that poetry can be dangerous. It affects your emotional state. Someone who listens to sad and lethargic music will himself become sad and lethargic. In other words, Socrates attributes a mimetic power to poetry that can quite literally drive people out of their minds. And this is very much in keeping with the Greek understanding of the power of the word, that it is a force, it is a means of impressing or of compelling. And so rhetoric can be seen as another form of word magic from the Greek perspective that gives you the ability to warp reality by controlling the way that people feel. You Socratics can spend all day educating people about the facts, but we Sophists will determine how they feel about those facts. And at the end of the day, which of the two is going to matter more for how people see reality? Or more importantly, how they think and how they act in response to that reality? And I think the answer is obvious. Contrary to what you may have heard, feelings always win out over facts. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, The most immoderate presumption of being able to do anything as rhetors and stylists runs through all antiquity in a way that is incomprehensible to us. They control, quote, opinions about things, and hence the effect of things upon men. They know this. A precondition, to be sure, is that mankind itself was educated in rhetoric, end quote. And so now I think this dispute, or at least the way that Plato presents this dispute in the Protagoras, can be unriddled for us. Protagoras purports to have an ethical teaching. He educates men to be prepared for political life. And what is the basis of that political life? Justice and wisdom, the gifts of Zeus to all men. But the instruction in the ways of justice comes in the form of force and punishment. And in fact, the entire political life of the Greeks, even within democracy, is a contest of opposing forces. The wars between Greek city-states were fought with the sword, but the wars that were waged within the city-states were fought with the tongue. Wisdom, prudence, therefore, is the ability to speak well, because he who's able to speak well is the one who can best wage the war with the tongue. And if we recall, the political life of the Greeks involved oratory in everything, from deliberating about economic policy to defending yourself in court, which every citizen is expected to do. How could you better prepare people for political life than by teaching them to speak? What would be more prudent? What would be more pragmatic than that? And that's precisely what Protagoras does. This is why his discourse on justice is so important. Because if we are able to act justly, to act rightly, that means we no longer employ physical force against our neighbors in the same city. We can no longer betray and defraud and steal from them. That would be unjust behavior, and Zeus's law will have us put to death for such behavior. But the establishment of that law, the establishment of civic life, it doesn't fundamentally change the agonistic nature of life itself. That life and the various forms of life, all within their differing aims and perspectives, contest with one another. If you are to flourish within the civic life, then it becomes an imperative of sorts, that you have to adopt the power, the tools, the weapons that prepare you for the form of combat that occurs within civic life, and that is oratory. Nietzsche argues in his lecture that a unique trait of the Greek mind was the ability, quote, to perceive all matters of the intellect, of life's seriousness, even of danger, as play, end quote. And there is something about the mindset that language is fundamentally an artistic domain, an exercise in expressing opinion and impressing one's view of things in a powerful way that is somewhat playful, in the same way that all art is, in its own way, playful. Whatever contains a degree of artfulness retains also a degree of subjectivity, of arbitrariness, of irrationality. And to the extent that we are aware that elements of our own arbitrary subjectivity are present, there is a degree to which we can become self-consciously playful. Or we might say carefree might be a good word for it. Or we might invoke the English phrase, the devil may care. You know, we may be locked in stark competition, but at the end of the day, it is only a game. Don't take it too seriously. Don't take it too morally, especially. And so as a final thought about this Greek fixation with oratory taught by the Sophists, it's worth noting that oratorical skill was one of the highest arenas of the agon, the Greek social competition between equals. We've already mentioned the symposia, the gatherings where they would drink wine and recite poems and speeches and compete with one another as to who could give the best speech or the best rendition of a poem and so on. And on almost all of these domains of competition, oratory is involved on some level. So it's very important to understand that it's not just an art that exists for the sake of prudence, for the sake of utility. It's not just that you practice oratory in order to hold sway over the opinions of others, or in order to legally defend yourself. It's an art that occupied even the leisure time of the ancient Greeks and drove that social competition which was definitive of their culture. And this is why it perhaps, as Nietzsche says, contains the seeds of their doom as they become obsessed with it as purely a form of leisure time. Nietzsche surmises that, perhaps the Greeks took this to such an obsessive extreme that it turned them into a nation of actors, as we said, a nation of surface-level men so concerned with just giving beautiful speeches that everything else atrophies. But what I want to impress upon everyone here at the end is that Nietzsche is right that the entire Greek culture in this sense belongs to the Sophists. And even though we've discussed this particular passage I'm about to read in a previous episode, that was the one on Thucydides, it's worth reading an excerpt from it here to conclude. This is from Daybreak number 168. Quote, "This culture, which has its poet in Sophocles, its statesman in Pericles, its doctor in Hippocrates, and its natural philosopher in Democritus, this culture which deserves to be called by the name of its teachers, the Sophists, and which, unhappily, from the moment of its baptism, at once begins to grow pale and incomprehensible to us, for henceforward we suspect that this culture, which was combated by Plato and all the Socratic schools, must have been very immoral. The truth of this matter is so complicated and entangled that we feel unwilling to unravel it. So let the old error veritate simplicior, run its old course." End quote. Error veritate simplicior. A rather ironic note to end on, because what that means is error is simpler than truth. The reason why Nietzsche says the matter is so complicated and entangled in my reading of this passage is because Plato succeeds in doing precisely what the Sophists claimed was the true power, superior to objective philosophical investigation, or whatever we want to call it. Plato affected the way that we feel about the Sophists, the way that we remember them, the way that their very name is used as a word, the same way that Callisthenes held the legacy of Alexander in his hands, while Plato held the legacy of Protagoras in his hands. And so it's difficult to argue that Socrates and Plato weren't, in some strange way, the better sophists. They ultimately triumphed in determining the opinions about sophistry and about rhetoric, which paradoxically proves them wrong, that philosophy is a superior art. Socrates and Plato do this as part of an act that attempts to bring forth, in Nietzsche's language, a revaluation of values, an overthrow of the immoral, unself-reflective Hellenic culture in order to usher in a culture that is moralistic and theoretical. And yet, in the same way that Plato's Republic, ruled by reason, must have recourse to the noble lie or the magnificent myth, they achieve this theoretical and moral revaluation by unfairly, we might say unjustly, tarnishing the good name of the Sophist school. Which is not to say that the Sophists were quote-unquote moral in the way that we would think about morality today. From everything we've gone over in this episode, it should be clear that that is absolutely not the case. And yet when we look to figures like Protagoras, at least from the Greek perspective, within the context of their social and political life, perhaps Protagoras was right to say that what he really provided for men was instruction in the ways of justice and virtue and prudence and how to behave in the civic life, which many people would say is to the good. And so Nietzsche says, I feel unwilling to unravel this. It is simpler to let the error endure than to attempt to disentangle the truth of the matter. And perhaps another irony is that in and of itself is also a sophistic teaching. Perhaps that's another layer of Nietzsche's irony here, that an error presented with beautiful simplicity can be far more powerful than the truth. It can have a stronger effect on the way people feel about a given truth. Any aspiring sophist, therefore, would do well to remember that, and paradoxically to look to the example of Socrates, the example of Plato, as expert sophists, those who were masters of the Pythanon, the power to reshape reality through their rhetoric, which is precisely what they did. That's all for this week, everyone. Noti Sotan, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.